This season, you're going to see Ohio State really change the way they use their wide receivers. So if you're expecting Jeremiah Smith and two other guys to simply play every meaningful snap like we've seen before in the past under Brian Hartline, I think you're looking at this room the wrong way. Ryan Day is telling us something pretty clear right now. This may be the deepest receiver room he's had in a while, and Ohio State actually intends to use that depth. Now, there may have been years in the past when it was deeper, but this year they intend to actually use that depth, and that's coming from Ryan Day himself. I know what some of you are kind of thinking, like, we hear this every August. We've heard about the talent and everything else. Everything is so deep. The room is so deep. Everybody had a great camp. Everybody's going to play. Then the big game comes, and suddenly you're only seeing 3, maybe 4 wide receivers out there. But this year is different. You have Cortez Hankton as the wide receiver coach. Ohio State believes they legitimately have 6 playable wide receivers, and Cortez Hankton in the past in his career has rotated a lot more than Brian Hartline traditionally did. Chris Henry Jr. is going to play a lot this season. Brock Boyd, the 3-star true freshman, is going to play a lot. Devin McEwen has forced his way into a major role. Kyle Parker gives them experience and versatility. Brandon Ennis is a captain, and obviously Jeremiah Smith, he's Jeremiah Smith. He's going to play a lot. So the question is no longer, does Ohio State have enough receivers? The question is, what happens when Ohio State actually starts using all of them? Because that can be a massive advantage. But there is also a real challenge here too. Rotating 6 receivers sounds great until you have to decide which receiver comes off the field when the game is tied versus Texas in the fourth quarter, or you're going up against that team up north and it's rocking and raging. Maybe you're down by a score early on and you got to draw something up to get a score. That's where it's really going to get interesting. Ryan Day believes Ohio State's wide receiver depth is significantly better than it was last season, better enough that he expects a lot of guys to play. That statement matters because this room has lost a lot of talent. You lost Quincy Porter, who's now at Notre Dame, Mylan Graham, who's also at Notre Dame. Those guys are talented receivers from a recruiting profile standpoint, looked like players Ohio State could build around, but never really caught on at Ohio State. Yes, Quincy Porter dealt with some injury and stuff last season, but he never even, never seemed to come on the way that we thought he was going to, especially with David Adolph playing more snaps than at times than those guys. And yet Ohio State's view coming out of this offseason is essentially, we got better anyway. And that is a strong statement about what happened inside this room. Losing Quincy Porter and Mylan Graham could have created the opposite narrative, right? You could have looked at those departures and worried that Jeremiah Smith and Brandon Ennis, those are your 2 dudes, and you really got unknowns left around them. But instead, Ohio State comes out of camp talking about how the room is deeper, they're more playable, they're more flexible. They went out, they got a transfer in Devin McEwen. They went out, they got some really good freshmen they feel good about. That doesn't mean that Porter and Graham aren't good. Nobody's saying that. Nobody's saying that. Please don't hear me say that. It means Ohio State believes the players who stayed and arrived, developed, created a room that works better for this offense. Talent on a recruiting spreadsheet and functional overall depth are not always the same thing. Think about how Ohio State has operated at receiver for most of the Ryan Day era. When the Buckeyes had Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave and Jackson Smith and Jigba, you wanted those guys on the field as much as possible. Same thing with Marvin Harrison Jr. Same thing with Emeka Egbuka. Brian Hartline's rooms were insanely talented, but the rotation could become top heavy because the guys at the top were often first round picks, or Brian Hartline just didn't feel like there was enough talent behind them to take them off the field. And I don't blame Hartline for that. I mean, Hartline showed he didn't have to go out and get a transfer. He developed his guys. His guys came up and they played well. If Marvin Harrison Jr. is standing next to me, I'm not rotating him all that much either, because the 6th receiver, just because he had a nice Tuesday practice. But then this year, 2026, this room it seems to be built differently. Jeremiah Smith is still the exception. In the meantime, I expect him to be on the field almost constantly. Maybe see a little bit more rotation, but almost constantly. You don't rotate the best player in college football just because you promised everybody equal turns. But after Jeremiah Smith, I think that's where Ohio State suddenly has options. And the options is really going to push everybody with everything they have. Obviously, somebody like Brandon Inniss has experience, but he's also got toughness. He's also a leader. He's somebody who blocks, and he's somebody that you can trust out there. Has he always been the best wide receiver out there on the field? No, he's not. But he has been somebody that the coaches feel like they can trust, so much so that he's the Block O recipient this season. His statistical production may not have matched what some expected when he first arrived. He might not be the first round pick that some expected when he first arrived, but the coaches do not hand out that level of responsibility by accident. And then you have Devin McEwen. McEwen might be one of the most important pieces in this conversation because he changes the geometry of this offense, I guess, for lack of better words here. And I've talked about how McEwen kind of changes things and how he's kind of the perfect counter to Jeremiah Smith. He can run, he can threaten you vertically, but reducing him to like just the fast guy, I think completely misses what he can do for this offense. His speed, his downfield ability, can force safeties to respect space they might otherwise use to squeeze Jeremiah Smith. If a defense wants to tilt everything toward Jeremiah Smith, like we've seen in the past, Ohio State needs somebody who can make that decision hurt, who in one play, you do one time, you lean too much to Jeremiah Smith, and it's a free 6 points for Ohio State. That's something that was underrated about the 2024 team that they had in Trevion Henderson. Right? That was something that the 2024 team had in Trevion Henderson that didn't always show up in that way, but he did have the home run ability that anytime he was in the game, you couldn't solely focus on Jeremiah Smith. Well, imagine you now have that out wide on the other side of the field. It's not just somebody you have in the backfield who plays not as many snaps during the game because, he was kind of used in not specialized situations, but kind of, in certain situations. And here's the biggest payoff, I think, of this six-man rotation. It's not just Devin McEwen and what he can do to help Jeremiah Smith. It's not just about keeping players fresh. It's about changing what the defense has to prepare for. If Ohio State substitutes receivers with different skills, but can still run the same concepts, the defense has to identify who is on the field, where they're aligned, and what combinations might mean. That is going to be something that teams are going to have a hard time with, because if it's just your running back, right? If it's just your running back, because you have three different running backs, one's good at running short yards, one's good at kind of being the home run guy, and the other guy's good at pass blocking, then you can kind of look at that and say, okay, that makes sense. But if you have Jeremiah Smith out there, and then he's out wide with Devin McEwen, and then Brandon Inniss in the slot, and then 2 plays later, boom, you got Brock Boyd out there in the slot, Jeremiah Smith, he's moved to the other side of the field, and Chris Henry Jr. is out there, and then boom, you run Jeremiah Smith in the slot, all the while you're changing out your running back, and you've got Legend Bay in the backfield, and the defense doesn't even realize it, and then you get the ball to Legend Bay, he's gone for 40 yards to get a touchdown. That would be one of the biggest benefits of not just the wide receiver rotation, but the rotation in general. This is the most naturally, kind of benefit of this that could happen when you really start to think about what happens to the defense. Now, we need to bring up Chris Henry Jr. in this conversation because he's especially important here to talk about as well. This is one of the most naturally gifted young receivers on the roster. He has size, he has catch radius, the way he is able to control his body up in the air. I know sometimes that doesn't always get appreciated for being a skill, but he really does have that ability to control his body, and he has a different physical profile than some of the other options out there. Yes, Jeremiah Smith can do those things too, but there is a different physical profile that Chris Henry Jr. has. The question was never whether Henry had the talent, it was whether there was enough opportunity for him early on. And apparently now there is. Ryan Day has said Henry is going to play, and that creates a fascinating, I wouldn't say problem, but just like a fascinating scenario, because Jeremiah Smith is not coming off the field very often. Well, he's sometimes, sure, but not very often. So Henry's role may require some creativity, not just to be the wide receiver 2 behind Jeremiah Smith. You're not using Chris Henry Jr. enough if that happens. Maybe he relieves another receiver. Maybe Ohio State moves, a guy around. Maybe there are packages designed to get more size on the field. But if Henry is too good to keep on the sideline, Hankton has to find snaps for him. And then you got the other freshman, Brock Boyd. And Boyd is the player that really tells me this rotation philosophy is real, because Boyd was not supposed to be the obvious freshman story in the class. There were a lot of people that watched the tape of Boyd and talked about how, this guy's a dude, he's going to play. But I don't think anybody expected him to just kind of be like a default 6-man wide receiver rotation type of dude. Maybe there's some people out there, and I'm going to eat my words on that, but I don't think when he was first coming in, I'm not even saying like spring practice, I'm saying when he first came in, anybody had those type of expectations for him, because he was only a 3-star recruit. He was only a 3-star recruit. He entered a room with Jeremiah Smith, Brandon Ennis, Chris Henry Jr. You had transfer Devin McEwen coming in. You had so much here, and the other highly recruited players, Phillip Bell and others like that. Jaquaden Guilford was the other. I think he finished a 5-star player, and Brock Boyd just keeps showing up. You keep hearing about him. Spring practice buzz and summer and fall camp, first team reps. I mean, you take your pick. He is shown up in every conversation. And finally, Ryan Day flat out saying that Brock Boyd will play in his most recent press conference. Day pointed to something about Boyd that I think is incredibly important for a freshman. And what Day basically said was that he comes in, he practices with a purpose. He comes in, he practices for real every single day. Now that sounds boring. I know it's not like a big reveal. That's not what I'm gonna, title the video here on YouTube. If I title it that, then they're gonna be like, oh, well, yeah, of course he practices every day, John. Okay, I get it. But coaches trust who are available, consistent, and assignment sound, especially at receiver, where one busted route can turn into an interception. Boyd has apparently earned enough trust that he mixed in with the other 1s and 2s and received a lot of first team work. That's not like maybe he'll catch 6 passes in garbage time this year type of thing. That is a freshman forcing the staff to make room for him. Now, let's talk about another guy here, another transfer, because I've mentioned Devin McEwen, but another transfer. Let's talk Kyle Parker, because he is almost the forgotten man here. Parker came over with Hankton and has experience playing both inside and outside. And that versatility matters, because you do not want substitutions to announce your offense or anything like that. If every time one player enters and only lines up in the slot, and another time only lines up outside, good defensive coordinators are going to find that. That's why we talked earlier about the rotation and how that can confuse things. Parker can help prevent that. The issue is that he's dealt with injuries during camp, so the 6-man rotation may begin as like a 5 until he's ready or fully ready to be there. We'll see when that is. But when he returns, he gives Hankton another chess piece. And that brings us to the philosophical shift. I don't think the biggest story is that Ohio State has 6 good receivers. I think the biggest story is that Ohio State has had absurd receiver talent before. The biggest story with this is that Ohio State seems prepared to structure the offense more for that talent that actually reaches the field. And that matters for 2026. And that matters for roster management. And that matters for getting freshmen in here. One of the hardest sales pitches at Ohio State has been telling elite receivers, yes, we develop first-round picks, but there may also be 3 future NFL players ahead of you. So that gets harder in the portal era. If an elite receiver believes he's fourth or fifth on the depth chart, another contender is offering him 50 snaps a game, he'll leave and go there in a heartbeat because he wants to play. Excuse me, a lot of these transfers are not willing to just sit around and see what happens. But Kyle Parker wanted to come because he also had his coach here, and that also matters. Ohio State has just watched talented receivers leave this past season, and now they're bringing them in. So if Hankton can build a real six-man rotation without sacrificing offensive efficiency, Ohio State gets 2 wins. It becomes harder to defend now, and talented players have more reason to stay. But I want to put a giant asterisk on this because there is a bad version to wide receiver rotation too. And we've seen kind of stuff like this play out in the past. You cannot rotate just to rotate. Football is not youth soccer. Everybody does not need to play equal minutes or equal snaps because their parents drove them to the game. The best players have to play the most. Jeremiah Smith should dominate snaps in meaningful situations. Brandon Ennis is clearly better at certain roles than other people, so you got to play him for those. If McEwen becomes the guy defenses can't handle, opposite of Jeremiah Smith, you keep him out there, and rotation should create an advantage. It should not erase the hierarchy. That is the balance that Hankton and Arthur Smith have to find. Quarterbacks develop timing and with the receivers develop a feel for cornerbacks during games. Sometimes a guy needs repeated snaps against the same defender before he recognizes how that corner is playing his route. Constantly shuffling people can disrupt the rhythm if you get too cute. So when Ryan Day says 2 receivers can play, I'm not expecting 6 receivers to get 35 snaps apiece. Sorry, it's like 2 receivers. 6 receivers could play. I'm not expecting 6 wide receivers to get 35 snaps apiece. The point is that Ohio State may have 6 receivers the staff actually trusts in real situations, but that doesn't mean that any of them are going to lead the team in snaps or anything. That is completely different from having 6 names on a depth chart. If you want to know when we'll find out whether this is real or not, I wouldn't use Ball State to get that answer. I do think that, early on in the Ball State game, we might see a little bit of what they're thinking, but I do think once Texas hits, that's when you can watch for this stuff a little bit more. Ball State can tell us who gets on the field, and that would be nice to know, but Texas will tell us who the coaches actually trust. When it's 3rd and 7 in Austin, who's beside Jeremiah Smith? When Texas is rolling coverage towards Smith, who does Julian Sayin look for? If Ohio State needs a vertical shot, is it McEwen? Is it somebody else? If they need size, does Henry enter into the game? If they need somebody dependable over the middle of the field, is Ennis that guy? Is Brock Boyd that guy? That is where this goes from just like August depth story to an actual offensive identity. And there is another reason I like this direction too. Julian Sayin should greatly benefit from this. A quarterback does not need 6 wide receivers catching 10 balls. What he needs is answers. He needs a player who wins when the defense doubles Jeremiah Smith, someone who can stretch the field, someone who understands where to sit against zone, size in the red zone, fresh legs in the games. And that's going to be important for Julian Sayin, because without his starting wide receivers out there, since they didn't rotate a ton, Julian Sayin was a little bit more inaccurate in those games against, I think it was UCLA and Purdue, when they didn't have some of their receivers. Jeremiah Smith missed a full game, or maybe it was Rutgers. He missed a full game, and he also missed half of the UCLA game, the second half. So if 6 different receivers give Sayin different answers, then this room becomes more valuable than just a traditional 3-man group if none of the other 5 individuals put up monster statistics. That's why I would be careful evaluating this room just by box score, just by snap numbers. One week, Devin McEwen might have the big game. Another week, it might be Brandon Ennis. It might be Chris Henry Jr. He may get 3 targets, but create a matchup that changes how defenses align. Boyd might make 2 third-down catches and barely show up in the finished stat line. The idea that Ohio State no longer needs every game to look the same, that's what depth is supposed to give you. That is where I come back to Porter and Graham. Ohio State lost 2 receivers to Notre Dame who on paper absolutely could have been part of the future. If you told Buckeye fans that this when they lost their transfers and happened that Ohio State would enter the season believing its receiver depth had actually improved, plenty of people would have laughed. They would have questioned you. But here we sit. Jeremiah Smith is the superstar. Brandon Inniss is the veteran leader. Devin McEwen brings speed and a different threat. Chris Henry Jr. is too talented to keep off the field. Brock Boyd forces his way into the rotation, and Kyle Parker brings experience, alignment, flexibility when healthy. And behind them, you got other guys. I mean, Desi Jones, Philip Bell, Jaquaden Guilford, they're still trying to force their way onto the field and could potentially do that through some special teams work first. That is not a room hanging on with its losing talent or anything. That is a room where the challenge is figuring out how to distribute opportunities. If Ohio State can, truly believes this group is better after losing Porter and Graham, then Hankton deserves credit for how quickly this room has taken off. Even though he didn't recruit all the guys, the room is taking off, and they are making them very deep in order to make this happen. So talent is obvious. The rotation should be there. But tell me, Buckeye fans, your thoughts in the comments. When Ohio State gets to Texas, which 3 receivers do you want on the field the most on the biggest third down of the game, in the biggest situations? Who are your 3 wide receivers you want to see on the field together? Subscribe for more daily Ohio State coverage here on the Buckeye Huddle podcast. You can get us on the Apple, the podcast, the Spotify, all those different podcast feeds out there. And then you can also find us on YouTube as well, youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. Please do like, subscribe, and then also come and join us over at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We appreciate everybody being here. Thanks again. Have a good one.